Our next speaker is going to be Tony Costello, who is a professor of architecture here at the college. Tony has done something remarkable in his many years as a professor at the College of Architecture and Planning. He has traveled throughout the state, and his work with numerous communities, bringing the students and the communities together to make some input in terms of what good design and good architecture can do for preservation planning. And he also created the Muncie Urban Design Studio, which tried to help Muncie and the downtown area in terms of preservation. But I'm going to let Tony explain to you what good design can do for Indiana communities.
When I took apart my canned slide presentation on our community-based workshops, or what we here at the College of Architecture and Planning do in small communities to hopefully customize it for this presentation, I didn't realize that its rearrangement, I hope, will add to and reinforce many of the things that Reed has just mentioned. And this morning, although I'm going to talk about a process that we here at the College of Architecture and Planning really believe in, and certainly have great faith that it helps a community to become more aware of itself, I would also like to raise some issues that I hope can foster some discussion. And that is Reed's optimism I share, but I also know that if half of this audience was made up of real estate developers and people who owned land on the fringe of many of our communities, I don't think we would have unanimity in the notion that downtown is where all the action should be. And I think as people involved in urban revitalization, historic preservation, I think we need to be aware that one of the real battles is an attempt to really show that historic preservation can be a vehicle for responsible community development. And in that regard, I'm going to really try to focus my remarks and, in a sense, the slides this morning on the importance of the process rather than the product. I could not match the slides that Reed showed, and so I'm glad I decided not to show any before and afters, because you've just seen them. And showing you 50 more of the buildings that were covered up, and then wonderfully they are resurrected and truly once again show through their brilliance of their original design, I think is not as important as trying to urge or trying to describe, if you will, a process of dealing with good design and community education and community awareness. In some ways, I think good designers, when they're involved in community design, have to be much more involved in the notion of human interaction than in design. Namely, the fact that design is an interactive process with a community, and therefore understanding people is as important as understanding the principles of good design. In many ways, designers become facilitators, people who can, in a sense, deal with community interaction, deal with issues, deal with controversy. And I think all of you out there involved in the day-to-day preservation movement know that, in fact, controversy simply comes as part of the turf. Just earlier this morning in talking with Reed, obviously Public School 5 in Indianapolis is probably the most current example of the fact that not everybody is in total agreement that preservation is the way to go. And so I think that reinforces the notion that we all have to be involved continuously in the process of education, in the process of making a community or helping a community to become even more aware of the richness of its past and its heritage, and that that can become, in turn, a vehicle for a better community in the future. I think with that, if we could have the lights and the slides, I will attempt to talk a little bit about the program and about some of the... We here at the College of Architecture and Planning, in dealing with communities, look at our involvement as one of combining education and public service. We, of course, at the college here at Ball State, we're the only state-supported College of Architecture and Planning, and therefore we believe that it is our obligation, part of our mission, to in fact serve the entire state of Indiana. What better way to do that than to deal with the revitalization of our urban centers? And as part of this program, as I mentioned, I really believe that what we do in the field, as opposed to really teach design, is we really deal with educating a community into an awareness and an ability to truly analyze itself and to be critical, to really understand what is positive about that community and, in fact, what is negative about that community. And in looking at a community, we have to deal with the fact of attempting to have a holistic approach to urban revitalization. And although the Main Street program does focus in on the downtown, it has been our experience that a community not only has to address the issues of a revitalized downtown, but of a total revitalized community. So that, in fact, the notion of improving housing stock, of providing better residential areas, of hopefully dealing with the idea of a controlled growth becomes very important if a community is going to improve itself. I think if downtown revitalization is seen as simply an involvement on the part of local merchants or the Chamber of Commerce or preservation groups, then I think a great percentage of the population of that community will not, in fact, be totally in favor of what is happening, will not be totally in favor of public funds being committed there, and therefore will not be as supportive of programs that might come out of a Main Street or downtown revitalization program. And in looking at a community, I would hope that as designers and as planners and as preservationists, whether from Ball State University or from Purdue or from the Main Street program, that we begin to try to look at the community in physical terms, because out of an understanding of a community's physical makeup, we can in fact learn and develop clues to what that community was and where that community might be going. But as I mentioned, most importantly, I think a community has to become aware itself that there are problems and that there is room for improvement. And I think as one of the things that we here at Ball State hold very important is the fact that we do not go into communities unless we are invited. The impetus for community revitalization must start with a community. And usually, as Reed mentions, it starts with a small group of people. One of the real, I think, tasks for us when we go in and work with the community is to try to expand the base of community involvement, to get people who are coming at community revitalization from a wide range of perspectives to join together and to realize that the preservationists do have a lot in common, in fact, with people who are looking at improving, for instance, recreational opportunities. That preservationists do have things in common with people who are concerned about better residential neighborhoods. Because in fact, what we're all about in the final analysis is attempting to improve a community holistically. That community being a better place to live, to worship, to educate, to enjoy the finer things of life. And therefore, one of the real hallmarks of our involvement, and as Reed showed, the involvement of Historic Landmarks Foundation and of the Main Street program, is the notion of an interactive design process. That in which the community literally takes part in determining their own future. Many of you in this room, I am sure, remember the old 701 comprehensive plan programs that came out of Washington in the 50s and 60s and 70s, in which for the most part planning was done in an isolated manner truly from the community. And community interaction and participation was really the two public hearings that were mandated by the legislation. And we know, in fact, that one has to almost search in a community to find the last remaining copy of that 701 comprehensive plan. And in most cases, we find it in the rare book section of the local library, gathering dust never to truly be used to guide that community in its future, because the people did not have a part in determining the future or the planning strategies in that particular program. And as one can see here, and as Reed has shown, the notion of inviting participation and structuring participation is one of the things that we at the college demand of our interaction with the community. It is something that upon initially going into a community, we try to sense. Simply, where is that community at with the idea of public participation in the process? Public in communities in which we have underestimated the ability of the public to participate, and we have overestimated the ability of the public to participate, especially on a long-term basis. Most programs initially are very aggressively embraced, and in fact, during the planning process, which in some ways is actually the easy process, one will have much unanimity and much support. When it gets down to the short strokes, and one really begins talking about financial commitment, the ability of building owners to truly make a financial reinvestment, that enthusiasm sometimes wanes, and that is extremely important, I think, in or for the design professionals to realize when they deal with a community-based interactive design. We certainly do here at the college, and we do see ourselves, by the way, as a front-end process, one in which we're attempting to get a community to understand itself better. And I will talk a little bit about at the end about what we see as our limitations, but what we also see as our primary role. In that regard, I think that good designers and good planners have to deal in all sorts of human interactive sizes, whether that's a large community meeting, a smaller interactive group situation, or in many cases a one-on-one, where in some regards probably the most important understanding takes place. I might say that obviously as an educational institution, one of our major goals is to give our students the best possible learning situation or instructional situation. And although that might not be of as much interest to the community, we here at the university still hold that to be very, very important. We do not ever see that in conflict, for I think in some ways the students are seen as a non-threatening entity, probably even more so than the faculty members, although I hope we are not seen as a threatening entity either. And in fact, many times I think can truly be very successful in dealing with community citizens who may be initially very suspect to what is going on. As I mentioned earlier, group interaction or community participation just does not happen. And we, in our process, very much deal with the idea of a concentrated involvement, especially in communities that are too far from Ball State's Muncie location for us to have an ongoing process. The communities in which we have been involved have ranged as far north as Crown Point, Hamilton, Valparaiso, and most recently this summer in the city of Elkhart. South, we have been as far south as Salem in Washington County. We have been as far west as Clinton and Sullivan, Rockville, and Brazil. So as you can see, our program has been able to accommodate the notion of serving communities remote from our Muncie location. And as this particular poster shows, which was for our Brazil workshop, we structure in the interactive workshops. And as Reed showed, these workshops take place in the community so that a better understanding of what a community needs to do to attempt to deal with historic preservation and total revitalization can come to fruition. Once again, this idea of structuring community interaction, and as Reed mentioned, when we deal with the physical environment, we need to deal with graphic imagery. You need to deal with understanding, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that. The idea of designers as educators willing to truly deal with making design an understandable process and making design elements understandable to the lay public. Much of the lay public out there is very willing to learn. In fact, they're very eager to learn. But education just does not take place by osmosis. Therefore, the dissemination of information becomes of paramount importance. Our college has extensively used the local newspaper as part of community education. We find it one of the best mediums to, in fact, have information conveyed to the public at large, not just that small group of people who are willing to come down and participate in a walking tour or, in fact, in a public meeting. By making this information available to the larger populace, we believe that revitalization issues become total public issues, not just that of a small, select interest group. We believe it is very important for a community to understand its history, not just its architectural history, but its development history. Because out of that understanding of its past, we believe can come an understanding of the future. And it's very interesting in our work in Beech Grove, in which the community had a certain self-image, that by talking about that community as being, in fact, a new town, platted and developed as, at that time, the ultimate industrial community or industrial city, I think they began to realize that, in fact, there was a certain historical continuity to why that image had developed the way it had, and that that was not necessarily a negative image, that that was a unique image and one that, in fact, they could build upon as they dealt with their Main Street revitalization. And so the ability of a community to know its history and to go back and gather that history is important. Obviously, for many of you in this room, that might seem like a fairly commonplace notion, because many of you probably belong to historical societies or historic groups, part of your function of which is to make sure that the history of a community is made known. And yet we find out that in many cases that the typical citizen who is not involved in preservation or historic efforts knows very little about the history of their community, and is often very fascinated and, in fact, very enthusiastic when one does deal with where that community has come from and why it has come from there. As Reed mentioned, and I realize I am repeating, but I think repeating certain elements is not bad, and that is that it is extremely important to take the time to truly help to make certain aspects of preservation understandable. One of the things that we have found that our workshop does do is to try to give the basics or the elemental notions of what is the difference between some of the terms that are constantly thrown around during debates about downtown revitalization. Terms like restoration, preservation, adaptive reuse, all of those things conjure up different images in people's minds and, in fact, different financial obligations. And so through some of the literature that has been produced here by Hari Eggink and other members of our faculty, we attempt once again to deal with that very important notion of public education. As you can see on the lower left, we also deal with the idea of compatible new construction. And I think that the more successful preservation efforts have been those that not only focus in on the existing structures, but also have a strategy to deal with the notion of new development in a sensitive and a mutually supportive manner. As Reed mentioned, we do have many gaps in our downtowns, and a good design or a good strategy for downtown development might in fact really endorse the notion of new construction. And I would hope that good new construction would in fact be very supportive of a historic district or a historically based downtown revitalization approach. Reed showed cartoons, which I think are very beneficial. We also show, if you will, in some fairly simple notions, what are the various components of a facade. And as Reed's cartoon showed, it is so often that we have the upper register in place, and when we talk about things like upper register, cornice, graphics, store windows, we find often that people do not really understand what those terms are unless, in fact, one begins to try to show those things in a rather simple diagrammatic graphic way. That, we hope, is part of what this university can do as we train our young designers and preservationists, is also to help to have them, in turn, educate other people as to what are these important ingredients in analyzing a building. On a larger scale, we would like to think that one of the things that we do in a community is to have the community look holistically at itself. Yesterday, Dave Hermanson talked about the importance of the courthouse and the courthouse square. We have come to the conclusion that, in fact, it is more important for designers and a community to be concerned about the total urban environment than to focus in initially on individual buildings, although at times the saving or the rescuing of an individual building may in fact be the impetus for total downtown revitalization, at least for the willingness of a community to listen to the notion of the total downtown. And in these graphics here, you can see this happens to be for the old Lake County Courthouse Square, or the Crown Point Square, in which one can begin to notice that we try to have a community deal with the idea not so much of individual buildings, but historically what have those buildings meant in terms of forming an urban space. We do not believe that the typical layperson cannot become involved with design at a more abstract level. And then when one talks about the importance of good sensitive infill construction, one can make a better case because of the understanding of what it means to have the courthouse square defined by structures. It is important also, as shown in the lower diagram, to have a community understand the importance of how spaces are used. Ultimately, of course, one of the things that separates design from other fine arts is the fact that we normally deal with the idea of usable objects or usable spaces. And therefore, the ability to understand not only the spatial implications of a courthouse square, but historically how they have functioned, both for the person on foot and for the motorized vehicle, once again starts to allow a community to make decisions about the notion of circulation, parking, and the pedestrianization of the courthouse square. This is where the preservationists have to be willing to listen to traffic engineers, and hopefully traffic engineers have to be willing to be sensitive to the concerns of the preservationists. That is where the local merchants who are concerned about parking have to be willing to listen to the concerns of the community that might look at trying to stack the optimum number or the maximum number of automobiles into a courthouse square, so that mutual issues are discussed. And very often we have found out that in fact very few communities have ever gotten a preservation group to truly sit down with the local traffic engineer to discuss what are the mutual concerns about the courthouse square. I think that is one of the very important things, and one of the things that we stress in our involvement in a community is, once again, this pluralistic or multiple issue approach. In the analysis of certain situations such as circulation, you can see some of the drawings that are turned out by a Ball State team composed of faculty and students, in which the assessment of a particular situation, and once again, this happens to be the Crown Point Courthouse Square, are defined in such a way that assets and liabilities are pulled out, and we hope simply explained to the lay observer or the lay public. And of course, as Reed showed with the before and after, these are, if you will, kind of an intermediate drawing in which we do not go from the before to the after, but rather go from the existing to an analysis of the existing, trying to point out on each and every building what are both the positive aspects, the assets, and the negative aspects, the liabilities. And this becomes very important in terms of trying to have a community understand better some of the design principles that you're going to put forth in terms of sensitive preservation or restoration or adaptive reuse of our buildings. And again, I think this happens to become a very key word. I think, if anything, the Ball State involvement, being, if you will, a front-end involvement with a community, really stresses the notion of helping a community to analyze itself and then in turn look at a strategy for action based on the potentials that come out of that assessment. The ability for a community to develop a community profile, I think, puts historic preservation and that whole component of revitalization into perspective. And one of the things we do in our workshops is, first and foremost, not to present solutions, but in fact to present a community profile, one that has been developed with them and by them, so that the citizens, in fact, are doing a self-analysis aided by the facilitation of our faculty and student team. And that, once again, takes place in the community in a series of workshops that, or a series of actual town meetings that precede our concentrated design workshop in a community, and also as part of those workshops. Normally, our involvement in a community will incorporate somewhere between 4 to 7 meetings before and after the concentrated community-involved workshop. And as you can see here, in asking a community to look at itself, we are dealing with issues as broad as location and transportation and the notion of the entries into town, so that the total environmental quality of a community is also assessed. And finally, what we develop, and in this case what is in fact published as part of our newspaper supplements, is, if you will, a very condensed and, we hope, correct community profile. The reason that we have every reason to believe that it is a correct community profile is because it has one that has been developed with the community. And it is one that, in fact, we feel truly does bring forth the negative aspects of the community as well as the positives. I think unless a community is really willing to address its liabilities, which may in fact be, as in the case of Muncie, some major buildings which stand vacant and which are seen as very key elements. Unless those issues are really aggressively addressed, then the whole notion of revitalization or improvement will not really be moved forward. Those are the ones that, as Reed well knows, takes the most amount of time, and that in fact create, in some ways, the most friction between different groups. And as you can see here in our evaluation that has been done for Brazil, that historic resources which occur up here are seen as one of many components that make up a community. And as we well know, that the historic resources are going to be tied into the commercial revitalization. In fact, they're going to be tied into public facilities, and in fact, might even be tied into the whole notion of a recreational use or adaptive reuse of historic buildings. So the idea of an interactive notion of historic buildings, we think, is very important, and one of the things here at the university that, or at the college and our community-based projects program, that we very much stress. We also stress trying to isolate or trying to pinpoint where those situations can readily be seen by a community. And as you can see here, through the use of aerial photography, we are able, in fact, to put the assets and liabilities in context. So once again, we take a community from, if you will, the more abstract notions of assessment down to, in fact, site-specific applications or site-specific examples of both the assets and the liabilities in a community. And as you can see here, once again, the idea of excellent historic facades is, in fact, right under the notion of poorly landscaped parking lots. Those are two issues in a community, and they're issues that both have to be addressed if that community holistically is going to improve itself. Of course, one of the things that, as Reed said, preservationists never talk without slides. Obviously, designers never talk without slides as well. And part of our involvement with the community is to help develop, if they do not already have such, some sort of a slide presentation that can be used to truly help with self-education, to bring to various service or civic clubs. And there is no finer way to do this than through literally a walking tour of a community, showing both the positive aspects of a community, some of the wonderful heritage, such as the Washington County Courthouse here in Salem, or a unfortunately unused but a little pressed metal commercial building over in Rockville, which for us is in some ways as important as the county courthouse, because although the county courthouse will have a great number of supporters, this little building here will in fact need to gain some advocates to protect it. And in some ways, in terms of architectural technology and architectural design, I think one realizes that this is in fact a very, very unique example and one certainly worthy of preservation, and very importantly, of this space here being optimally used in the future functioning of the downtown area. And of course, we are often very lucky enough at least to show that in some cases buildings have been maintained and are actively being used. We also, of course, have, as Reed pointed out, numerous examples of, if you will, semi-sensitive, at least, preservation. But all too often we can also show rather negative or rather insensitive handling of our historic buildings. And yet, when one shows a slide like this, as Reed once again mentions, one always has to be optimistic and talk about the potential of these particular buildings, which in fact, in some ways, remain significantly intact, even in terms of their detailing. The assessment is always presented, as I mentioned. We present this at one of two very important public functions, which we call our public forum, and it is very important that that particular type of assessment is viewed by the community at large. As Reed showed with some of the town tour workshops, our workshops also take place right in the community. The design work is done in the community, in which building owners and merchants can come in and, in a sense, interact with the design work as it is going on. The ability of our students and faculty to generate, if you will, design images, we feel is a very, very critical element of, once again, adding to the understanding by the lay public of exactly what are the issues at hand. And finally, of course, the presentation of these ideas in an open public presentation of findings, where the culmination, at least, of this community's initial attempt to look at revitalization comes to fruition. And what's very important is that this work here is looked upon as the community's work, not as Ball State's work or any other outside consultant's work, but in fact it is work that has been generated, although not by their hand, by their ideas, by their thinking, and by their understanding. I mentioned the need for any revitalization program, the way we see it in the early going, to truly be involved in all issues. And for a downtown to truly come to grips with some of its problems, both physical and economic, it is important for it to begin to look at what is happening on the outskirts. It is very difficult to deal with commercial revitalization, which in many ways is the underpinning of physical structure revitalization, if one is not concerned with the idea of commercial development on the periphery, because we know that there's an ongoing struggle by our older communities to in fact battle against the newer commercial development. When one talks about a sensitivity to an entrance into town, one can talk about, as one sees here right now, what is the current development of entrance into Brazil versus what might be through some sort of a landscaping or improvement program, so that one is not made to travel through a half a mile of what we usually call Franchise Alley with all of its visual defects in order to get to the historic heart of the downtown. And of course, once again, as designers, we are most concerned with the idea not so much of individual buildings initially, but the necessity for a community to recognize the larger urban context. And in communities, obviously, that have courthouse squares, that means first and foremost the notion of being involved in a total environmental design, evaluation, and proposal. The ability for a community to have good signage and graphics cannot be downplayed. If one is dealing with a functioning downtown that will invite shoppers to return to our historically preserved buildings, then we have to deal with the notion of the ability for that shopper to find parking and for that shopper to then find the facilities that they want to use. It also involves, as Reed pointed out, streetscape improvements. The best preserved or restored historic buildings will not be as attractive to downtown shoppers if the sidewalks remain in a state of neglect. And so part of our, again, approach is to try to put forth the idea of pluralistic design, that exterior space or urban space revitalization goes hand in hand with specific building revitalization. And that something which may be looked upon as a liability, namely the alleyway system, can in fact, as shown here, become a marvelous amenity. If one helps a community through, again, photography and through imagery to look at the potential of being able to gain access to the historic courtyard from, let's say, parking through use of an alleyway. And these are the kinds of things that we hope our program, if you will, brings to the fore or makes more visible to a community. And then, of course, as with every program, we do become involved with showing a community what might be. What is the potential for these buildings through a sensitive restoration and preservation and adaptive reuse program to be something new. We purposely do our drawings, as you can see, in a rather quick manner. One of the reasons being that we do not like to put forth any initial design ideas as, excuse the expression, being etched in stone. We put them forth, if you will, as a series of talk pieces, ones that we hopefully, or ones that will hopefully generate discussion and will generate some enthusiasm, to then be looked at in a much more precise and exact degree by professional architects who would be employed and commissioned to study specific buildings. And finally, as Reed mentioned, maybe we can never be, or maybe sometimes we need to be a little less serious. And one of the things that I think you know is very important to a downtown are festivities and events that bring people there. Preserved and restored buildings are going to only be innate objects if they are not, if you will, viewed and used by the people. And so we also get involved in how a downtown can become a much more active place, not only for commercial interaction, but also obviously as, once again, the social hub of the community. We always bring this back together in trying to look at the community as a whole. And we feel that that is one of the, again, very important items that come out of our initial engagement with the community, is this ability for a community to view itself in a holistic manner. To wrap up, we try to leave the community with the most information that can be, in fact, disseminated to the greatest number of people. And therefore, as you can see here, our work with the local newspapers goes beyond that of a news story, but in fact is involved with helping to produce the idea of a tab or a special supplement totally devoted to downtown revitalization. And once again, in all cases, we really, in fact, stress the idea of potential, the idea that a community must build upon its assets and must rectify its liabilities in order to improve itself. And obviously, as Reed so amply pointed out in the Main Street program, one has to put forth the notion of public-private sector cooperation, that no program is going to work unless both governmental bodies at all levels and the private sector really make a mutual commitment to the improvement of that particular downtown. And as you can see here on one of the inside pages, this happened obviously to be for our Clinton study, you can see here that we once again, through this particular headline, talk about the fact that new development is compatible with adaptive reuse, and that in fact facade restoration, the adaptive reuse of a historic railroad station, and a new community center can all work hand in hand to generate, in this case, the idea of a town square, in which one did not exist before, but out of the people's assessment was the fact that that's what the downtown lacked, was a space where a community could come together and in fact have social and cultural interaction. And so to close with a slide of, once again, an aerial view, I believe of Rockville, in which I want to put forth the notion that as designers here at Ball State, we are very aware that the development of 1,000 pictures, or graphics if you will, is not as important as a designer's sensitivity to human interaction and to community interaction. And part of our community-based program is to have designers in communities, in the fact of faculty and student teams, that are sensitive to the notion that design fruition, or that design and good design will only come to fruition if, in fact, it is based on total community involvement in the process of urban revitalization. We can have the light, Steve, and turn off the slides. I will close with simply a few remarks. I realize, as Reed mentioned, that many communities are probably far beyond the stage in which, actually, that I've shown. In fact, Reed mentioning Valparaiso, mentioning Warsaw, those are all communities that Ball State has been involved with in the past. And in a sense, I think it shows that Ball State's involvement as, if you will, an initial catalyst at making a community aware of its potentials will lead to a much more permanent, ongoing involvement of, let's say, a Main Street program. I don't think the two programs are necessarily mutually exclusive. In fact, I see them very much as, if you will, a sequential notion. If communities are interested in Ball State's involvement, you can simply write to the Community-Based Projects Program, care of the college here, and we will be in contact with you. One of our major problems is the timeliness with which we can respond, since we normally lag behind somewhere between a year and a half to communities in terms of being able to respond to them. With that, I will open it for questions. I'll take Mary Fran first. Okay. The question was, I think I heard the first part, how important is it for public officials, building commissioners, building inspectors to have an understanding of preservation, restoration, adaptive reuse? Very, very important. And in fact, I made mention of the notion of public-private sector cooperation. Obviously, one of the things, I shouldn't say obviously, I did not mention this. Many times we are called into a community by the local Chamber of Commerce. They are one of the groups that most oftenly contacts us. And very honestly, that group is most interested in the idea of increasing the commercial viability of the community. That is their particular bias or their particular focus, and well, it should be. At our first meeting, when we ask who people are representing, we will say, okay, at the next meeting, you need to have here the mayor, president of city council or town council. If there's not a mayor, then the clerk treasurer and the town council need to be there, at least representatives. If not, what is going to happen is at some point in time, you're going to be asking those people to take part in the program. Whether it's the building commissioner who you're asking to take a look at an adaptive reuse proposal, and if you will, make a ruling on a certain adjustment to a code. And any of you that have been involved in adaptive reuse, you know that meeting the health, safety, and welfare aspects of a building is what in many cases is the most difficult thing. If that building commissioner or that building inspector is part of the process and is invited to take part, and in fact, if that building commissioner is asked for input from their perspective, I think you will find that it's human nature that when then you go to ask them, and I don't like to use the word favors, but ask them to be responsive to a request, that person will most likely be much more positive in their approach, because it is seen as a team effort, not as an adversarial situation. I think as soon as it's seen as an adversarial situation, obviously then the battle lines are drawn, and we know on any project that we can nitpick it until the project simply will not go forward. Reed, did you?
Tony, how do you decide which towns you're going to select? How many can you do a year? And do you all charge now? Or
yeah. Okay. The question is, what criteria do we use to select what towns we will work with, or in what sequence we will take them, and what is the charge? I would like to say it's a first come, first served basis, but in fact that's not exactly true. The reason being is upon an initial visit by myself or Professor Eggink or Professor Munyar, we find that communities are at very different stages of, if you will, the way they're organized. And many communities, we feel, are really a year away from taking part in an extensive community workshop. A phrase might be they do not have their act together yet. And part of that first year, as I stressed with the idea of being a facilitator for human interaction, will be to try to get that community in terms of human resources aligned and working together enough that the workshop is going to really be meaningful. But if everything being equal, we will normally take the community that has requested our assistance first. We have done as many as 3 of these workshops in an academic year and found that that's just an impossibility, that the amount of prep time, the amount of post-workshop follow-up is just too demanding on our resources, and usually we will do about 2 a year. The cost varies greatly depending on how much the community, if you will, I don't want to say how much that community has financially, but what is the magnitude to which they want us to be involved in that community. And so this summer, although I was not involved in it, Hari Egink and Michelle Monier and a group of students worked in Elkhart and worked very intensively over a 3-month period, although it focused in on 2 major charrette workshops. The same thing last year, Professor Hermanson and myself and Hari and Michelle and about 6 students worked in Crown Point for a period of several months, again culminating in 2 intensive workshops. And there the cost was somewhere in about the $7,000 range. Other communities in which we do a much more reduced involvement and are not in anywhere near coming up with that amount of time committed, and in fact, in terms of the physical products produced, will normally run somewhere around $1,000 in terms of, that's right, the community pays that.
Tony, it's not a question. You might wish to comment on the additional facility we'll have. How difficult it has to do some things like you had to do.
Okay. I'm just going to follow up on Dean Fisher's remark. Probably online in 4 months. Online in 4 months, 5 months? Online. Okay.
Somewhere before the first of the calendar year.
Okay. Probably online then by the beginning of 1986, our college will have a mobile studio, or really a mobile support vehicle, which is a 36-foot long RV, totally customized so that our technical abilities in the field will be equal to just about our technical abilities back here at the college, including full photographic, graphic reproduction capabilities, microcomputer possibilities would hook up back here to our energy center for doing on-site energy assessment, which in many cases are very important in historic buildings, and obviously our ability to simply carry a lot more technical resources into the field with us. The rumor that you may have heard that on order are also very dark blue jumpsuits with caps and cap SWAT team on them is not true. We will still dress in our normal manner, and we will not have our students fling open the door and come out with T-squares and run around town with their backs against buildings. But it is going to give us, and to our knowledge, it will be the first university in the United States to have such a capability, and as Dean Fisher said, will greatly improve our ability to serve communities in this remote way. Luann, you had a question. Here in Muncie? Yeah, the best thing would be to contact the Muncie Urban Design Studio. Very importantly, and I think this always has to be understood, and that is that we walk a very thin line, and we always try to stay on our side of it, between what we should be doing as an educational institution and what the professional practicing architect should be doing out there. Our aim, as you saw, is to really generate talk pieces to develop initial ideas to help a community coalesce into a functioning group. Here in Muncie, where we've been involved in this, we will look or assist individual building owners with some, up to, again, the best of our ability, time and resource-wise, with looking at adaptive reuse possibilities, looking at the way the facade might be handled. And we have done those. We literally have drawing upon drawing upon drawing of those for many of the buildings, but that is something that the Muncie Urban Design Studio can do here. As soon as you know that you need or desire the service, you should get in contact, because a lot of it depends on what particular classes are committed that particular quarter to the studio, what level are they, what discipline do they represent, and so it is simply wise to get that request in as soon as possible.
What's the smallest community you've worked with?
The question is, what's the smallest community? We are proud to say that we've actually worked in a community without a stoplight. You know, the notion is, well, I come from a one-stoplight town. Well, we've worked in communities with no stoplight, and that was a little community of Sharpsville, north of Tipton. I believe their sign says 628. So that's pretty small. Main Street there consists of approximately 6 commercial enterprises. And the real reason that we were invited into that community, by the way, it's interesting how certain issues, again, we're invited into communities for various reasons, and then we asked that community to look at itself in a more holistic manner. They had an abandoned school that through consolidation was no longer being used, and the building was beginning to deteriorate, as unused buildings do, very rapidly. And out of that, interestingly enough, we began to deal with the idea of a community revitalization. By the way, sometimes you lose the battle but win the war. A portion of that building has been demolished. It was the fact of, what does a community of 628 people do with an enormous building? There was no economically viable use for a portion of that building. And after the third winter of being unheated, when literally the roof was collapsing in, the responsible thing in that case was, in fact, to remove a portion of that building. But what's interesting is that that community has come together and, in fact, have made some very wise decisions concerning additional recreational facilities on that site. And the local businesses have, in fact, begun dealing with a facade restoration program. So you never know what's going to come out of a revitalization effort.
I don't answer the question I wanted to ask. I was going to ask if you had any direction there. What has happened in the towns you've gone in the past few years, particularly those towns which have not established some sort of Main Street program?
In fact, that's one of the shortcomings, and I will take the blame for that. We've been so busy doing them, we have not done a very good job at going back and recording our successes, and very importantly, our failures. I think in any program, it is maybe even more important to know why a community did not go forward. Is there anybody here from Valparaiso? Okay. I would like to think that much of the work that has been done in Valparaiso has been, in fact, part of Ball State's involvement, which has involved a number of facade restorations. It has involved, in fact, the total reconstruction of some facades along what one might call a historicism or a historically based design intent. Re-landscaping of many parking lots, a whole new graphic system. And what's interesting there, and I think this might be a very important clue to for some other communities, we actually were called in following a study that was done by Johnson, Johnson and Roy, a very well-known, nationally known firm of landscape architects and planners out of Michigan. I'm not quite sure what community. And that was a $30,000 study. You know, your typical 200 pages, very fine. 175 pages are what you get in any study. They are the prototypical design intents, and the 25 pages if your proofreader is really good, are going to be only about your community. And it simply overwhelmed them. It simply overwhelmed them. They were unable to really deal and cope with this incredible number of recommendations. And something that, you know, was heard here is, where do we start? And through one of our alumni, Spiro Valvanis, who is a practicing architect with a design organization who, in fact, are doing a lot of the work there, and I think a lot of the very much high quality design work there, very interactive with clients. He came to us and said, would there be the ability for your program to somehow take this report, sit down with us, extract what we, not simply us, but we in the community, think are the items that would be most appropriate to be a phase one, and then can you give us some additional design input? So in that case, we actually almost acted as a filter or as a refinement unit to take this massive amount of information and to begin to hone in on some things. Certainly the communities of Warsaw, Wabash, communities that Professor Hermanson has been involved in for a number of years. I say this with Dave here. I think all of you know that there are probably a number of courthouses that are standing in communities because of the work that Dave Hermanson has done to have them remain there. Lafayette being a very good example of that, another community that we were involved in about 12 years ago. There have been a lot of successes. The successes or the failures totally depend on that community in the sense of being able to really go forward. And the ones that have been successful have been those that have committed funding and have had a commitment on the part of the local governmental units and a real strong commitment from the private sector. I think those have been one of the, if you will, those have been the criteria that seem to be consistent. We know, for instance, with neighborhood work, and I put neighborhood work in the preservation category. I know this is a Main Street conference, but I think Main Street and downtowns will only be successful up to a point unless, again, holistically, the neighborhoods surrounding them are taken into account, and a preservation, restoration, revitalization program is mounted there as well. There we know that it takes an ongoing commitment by the residents. I mean, a real commitment, not only to their own building, if they own it, or structure, but also to community issues. And so those are some of the criteria. And in other communities that have not gone ahead, we have probably misjudged their readiness, and they have misjudged their real commitment when it came right down to it. But those that have gone on after, for instance, the town tour program, I'm sure Reed can tell you, it's where the town tour program was a catalyst, and then that was, in fact, followed up. What?
Madison merchants aren't doing too well along Main Street. Not the gift shop, maybe with the preacher.
Mm-hmm.
It is because Marble Hill is
The question was, or the comment was, that some of the merchants in Madison are not doing too well. There are a lot of merchants in a lot of Indiana communities not doing too well. There are a lot of merchants in communities which are working tremendously to stabilize their downtowns that are not doing too well, because in some communities there's an equal amount of acreage every year rezoned for commercial development on the periphery that equals the entire downtown area. And when a community does that, then that becomes a very, and I'm not going to line up on one side or the other than to say, I think that's where a community has to look at itself holistically and deal with a total notion of planning and revitalization. Because there are going to be forces in communities that are going to be diametrically opposed. And, you know, we as a city, for instance, every time I believe a new intersection needs to be signalized out on McGalliard, I think the signalization runs somewhere around $125,000 or something to do a total signalization. So that's public funding that is going there to serve then an expanding Muncie. What would that $125,000 do if that was put into public improvements in the downtown, which would in sense reinforce the downtown? That is very, very difficult, and that is something that we have come to a conclusion of, and that is painting up and fixing up the facades of buildings is a very, very small part, obviously. And that's where the Main Street program is very much geared to the whole notion of marketing, the whole notion of commercial revitalization. And the physical improvement is just one, am I not right, just one aspect of that. But, you know, there in a sense is a, you know, you mentioned Marble Hill. That is actually a regional environmental situation that's affecting, I'm sure, not only Madison, but I'm not sure if it's not affecting us here in Muncie. I'm sure some way we're paying for that thing. Somebody's going to, while it sits there and rusts. Question is, do communities ever maintain a good balance between new development and a revitalized downtown? Yes, they do if that community is in a real growth situation. I think Indianapolis has to be looked at as an example in which the downtown has really prospered. And I think all we have to do is drive around 465 to realize that there are literally mini cities being developed around the periphery. So that community has. One would only ask oneself, you know, what would be the downtown of Indianapolis if all of that development had been more concentrated? But then maybe we would have lost more historic buildings. So growth pressures are very, very difficult. I think that takes a community that is very sensitive to the notion of growth management. And there, you know, we need new development. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But we also need a firm commitment then to a downtown. And could there be the possibility of generating an environment that makes new development better downtown than on the periphery? I mean, that is in a sense the kind of ultimate goal, isn't it? To have new development, but have it impact or implode in the downtown area, where we have existing infrastructure, where we have already many of the services.
The observation Tony about that is it may or may not be true. It's something that I've seen, I'm noting in Indianapolis, the city, which was developed in more or less the shape of a donut, then downtown, very strong development all around downtown. Now, it seems to have something occurring that is very interesting in Indianapolis. It's maybe not true, not essentially true. We have growth being pulled out 465 in inward, city center. What was the solid part of the donut appears to be becoming a void. The North Keystone, I think, is going to
Yeah.
die in the Northeast. And there are a number of other areas of that type, so it's being pulled in two different directions. I'm not right. I've never seen before.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about cities is we know that it's cyclical. We know that they will continue to change. And part of that is how aggressively is a community going to try to structure and control that change for the overall or the public welfare, and how much are they not? And there's no easy answer to that. we go through phases. And we know, all of you that have been involved in grant applications out there, you know that there are key phrases that kind of come in and go out every 5 years, and if they're not in your grant, you don't get the grant. Job generation, or employment right now. I mean, if you can show you're going to generate jobs, you can just about do anything. I mean, I'm convinced, because you're generating jobs. Well, what is the ultimate cost of generating those jobs? I know many of you in this room are involved day to day with showing that preservation is good business. I think that was even the theme of one of the preservation weeks not too long ago. I mean, it is good business. It makes sense to use our resources. We know that. Do the realtors know it? Do the bankers know it? Those are the people that ultimately need to know it, And what we